That worked. Okay, welcome everybody. Now you hear my voice. I'm Jerry Singerman. I'm the Humanities Editor Emeritus at the University of Pennsylvania Press and one of the co-organizers of these workshops, which are now in their fourth week of this year and 29th year of their lives. Quite extraordinary. So I'm co-organizers along with Zachary Lesser, who is the Edward W. Kane Professor of English here at Penn, and John Pollock, who's Curator for Research Services at the Kislak Center and who has an announcement to make.
Now?
Yeah.
All right.
Okay.
Hello, everybody. I think the Zoom people can probably hear me. Nice to see so many of you. I don't always announce Kislak events and affairs, although they probably should, but I want to make a particular shout out to an exhibit that we just opened because it's actually quite relevant to you photography fans that I hope are here or tuning in. The exhibit is called Arthur Tress and the Japanese Illustrated Book. It's in our gallery right on the 6th floor in the Kislak Center here, and it's a startling and interesting juxtaposition of the work of contemporary photographer Arthur Tress and some of the Japanese illustrated books that he himself donated to the Penn Library a few years ago. Spectacular collection. So Julie Davis and the Institute of Art and her students have organized the show. You'll hear from them later in the semester on Monday, but especially for those of you in the vicinity of Penn, please know about it. Have flyers, other information if you want to know more. And go photography.
And don't be dissuaded if you go by the gallery and everything looks dark inside, because it always is. And when you open the door, it will be illuminated.
Enlightenment will. Yeah.
Okay, so we are the organizers. We are organized in turn by Eileen Malcolm, who's the Bristol Schoenberg Fellow in the History of Material Texts. So we're there. And really, Eileen is the one who keeps us on track. Housekeeping notes for those present, please sign the sign-up sheet as it goes around. And if you're not yet on our mailing list, please include your email address, and Eileen will make sure that you do get our weekly announcements. And to those joining us remotely, welcome. Please make sure to mute yourselves during the talk, but please make yourselves known and present during the Q&A, either by posting your comments to the chat function, which Eileen will be curating, or during the Q&A session by using the raise hand function to pose your questions, and we will recognize you and ask you to unmute yourself. One further note before starting is that we acknowledge that this evening's presentation takes place at a time when large numbers of staff at our speaker's home institution are currently on strike for better wages, benefits, and working conditions. We're aware of this, of course, and of the long simmering issues that have now come to a boil, and it has been a matter of concern to us in recent days. Late last week, Zach reached out to a representative of the striking union who responded that while canceling or rescheduling this evening's talk would be seen as an act in support of the striking workers, proceeding as we have decided to do would in no way be construed as a sign of lack of support on our part. So before holding on to our plan to host Peter Barberie, in other words, we sought assurances that this session would in no way constitute a real or figurative crossing of the picket line in the eyes of the union. So we are satisfied that it does not, and we hope for a speedy and satisfactory resolution of this crisis for everyone whom the dispute touches: the museum's unionized and non-unionized workers and its professional and managerial staff, to be sure, but also the people of our region and far beyond, for whom the Philadelphia Museum is a vital, highly valued, and much loved cultural institution. So Peter Barberie is the Brodsky Curator of Photographs in the Alfred Stieglitz Center of the Philadelphia Museum of Art. Prior coming to the PMA full-time in 2008, he held the Horace W. Goldsmith Curatorial Fellowship at the museum, and this while studying at Princeton, the institution from which he took his doctorate in the history of art in 2007. In addition to his curatorial work at the PMA, Peter has taught at Rutgers, Princeton, and Penn, and in 2016, he earned a certificate in museum management from the Columbia Business School and the Center for Curatorial Research. At the PMA, he has organized or collaborated on numerous memorable exhibits, including Common Ground, 8 Philadelphia photographers of the 1960s and 1970s, Zoe Strauss, 10 Years, Prom, photographs by Mary Ellen Mark, Long Light, photographs by David Lieb, and this one out of chronological order, Paul Strand, Master of Modern Photography, an exhibit showcasing what could only be a small section of the nearly 3,000 prints from the Strand Archive at the Aperture Foundation, whose acquisition by the PMA Peter initiated. In addition or conjunction, he has written or edited numerous books and catalogs, most published in coordination with the Yale University Press to accompany the exhibits, and most recently, Richard Benson, The World is Smarter Than You, published by Yale, 2021. It's on the table, I must add. In addition to the selection of regular books, there is that huge and gorgeous and very special book that Peter will be discussing later. And it is a very, very generous gift of Yale University, who holds few copies and today fewer copies than last week. So now it was in fact just around this time last year that the Richard Benson Show opened at the museum. This was, as anyone who saw it can attest, a stunning and very beautiful exhibition on a brilliant and innovative figure, a photographer who, in the second half of the 20th century, and I guess the opening years of this one, rethought photographic processes and technologies in deeply influential, even prescient ways, not in the least in an attempt to close the gap he saw between photographs and their reproduction in printed books. I confess to my shame that I did not know Benson or his work before reading about the exhibit in a lengthy and one can say ecstatic review in the New York Times. But upon entering the galleries at the museum, it did not take me long to know that we just had to invite the person who had put this together to speak to our group. We did so, and I'm delighted beyond measure that he accepted our invitation. So please join me in welcoming Peter Barberie, who will be speaking to us this evening on Richard Benson and the end of printed pictures. Thank you.
So as Jerry explained, my talk this afternoon derives from the exhibition and book I organized last year, titled Richard Benson, The World is Smarter Than You Are. The purpose of that project was to showcase Benson's achievement as a photographer. Benson, who lived from 1943 until 2017, has long been celebrated in small circles as a printer of other artists' work. Indeed, he was involved in producing many of the greatest photo books of the past 50 years. He is equally celebrated in similarly small circles as a teacher, a great teacher at the Yale University School of Art, where he began instructing in the 1970s and served as dean in the final decade of his career there from 1996 until 2006. Benson's own photography has received less attention than these other accomplishments. My argument in the exhibition was that his remarkable achievement can only be fully appreciated by looking at his photographs, his writings, his printing, and his teaching together. Today, I'm not going to talk about all of those things because I keep you here until midnight. So I'm going to focus specifically on several key examples of how Benson's experiences with books and photographs informed his thinking about both. But first, I will say a few more words about the man himself, because he is not a household name by any means. Richard Benson was a curious and unconventional figure in the contemporary art world he inhabited. He was an autodidact and polymath. A single undergraduate semester at Brown University had convinced him that academic schooling was not for him. He preferred to learn about things by doing them or building them from scratch. That is what he did for the rest of his life, time and again. By the end of his life, he was arguably the most knowledgeable practitioner in the entire history of printing. And I mean that seriously. It sounds like an exaggeration, but I really think that in the millennia's long history of printed words and pictures, Benson explored every known process as deeply as anyone else. And that was brilliantly demonstrated in the exhibition that he organized at MoMA in 2008 called The Printed Picture. And the book for that is here, and I'll talk about it a little bit further into my discussion. He was also deeply interested in all kinds of technologies, and I won't go too far into that except when it comes up in some of my slides. But he was really fascinated by the history of technology writ large from the beginning of human experience, and that informed his thinking about printing very much. Benson was skeptical, if not dismissive, of artists who did not know how to make things. This commitment to craft put him at odds with much important art of the 20th century. However, Benson was no Luddite, and he certainly was not nostalgic about old-fashioned ways of doing things. In fact, he embraced technological disruption and change more deeply than most of his contemporaries. The title of my talk today nods to the fact that towards the end of his long career devoted to printing, Benson championed the idea that printed words and pictures, as he understood them, were finally coming to an end. Now, he was a man of contradictions, as so many brilliant people are, and I'm not certain he ever would have entirely given up on printing, but he was ready to declare that it was over and that the digital age had fully arrived. He had started showing his photographs on screens by 2016. So with that, I'm going to turn to a few specific examples, and look at that. The cursor did that thing. There we go. Here I'm showing you two photographs Benson made around 1980 in Puerto Rico of a very old steam engine that he had come across in a field. Now, he understood immediately that this engine would have originally had a shed or a barn protecting it. The structure had long since disappeared, and this was the only remnant left of one of the many small sugar plantations that had dotted the island of Puerto Rico in the 19th century. Benson and his family traveled to Puerto Rico frequently. They would go every year or every other year. This was at the beginning of their long relationship with the island. One of his fascinations was steam engines. He really loved them. He built a few of his own. And he recognized this one as an early version of the sort of original steam engine invented by a Scots engineer named James Watt in 1776. That's why he called this the Scottish engine. That's not a sort of everyday term, even that historians of science would use, but he dubbed it the Scottish engine because he knew the history of its invention so well. And one thing to understand about Benson is that he actually valued cumulative knowledge, the knowledge of generations tinkering with machines or with inventions and improving them constantly. He valued that kind of knowledge, I think, much more than he valued the sort of the great discoveries of invention, or the sort of breakthroughs that are often celebrated in our narratives about history. So that was very much on his mind when he photographed this machine. And it also informed his thinking about printing, and I'll return to that a few times in my talk. The reason I'm showing these two images is that they were made on the same day, I believe, of the same machine, but they are very different prints. And of course, if you saw them in person, it would really become clear. But the image on your left shows you a gelatin silver print that Benson made around the time that he took the photograph, so around 1980. And it's a contact print, meaning it's the same size as his negative. Generally, until he made the shift to digital photography around the mid-90s, Benson always used the view camera. So imagine a big box on a tripod with a sheet negative that was 8 by 10 inches. And he almost always made his prints the same size as the negatives, because that's how you get the clearest, sharpest print of any image. And it was a beautiful day in Puerto Rico when he made the picture. So you get this kind of wonderful landscape beyond. the steam engine. And I always chuckle over the sort of classical columns that form part of the machine, which I think he also would have gotten a kick out of as a sort of prehistory of the industrial era that this sort of marks. Now, the image on the right, I don't know if he ever made a print of this back in 1980, but in the mid 2000s, probably around 2005, he made this print, which is very different. It is larger; it's almost twice as large as the gelatin silver print, and it's not made in a darkroom at all. It's made on a computer printer. And it's a little hard to see it in these slides, but it has a different tonality. It has kind of a nice bluish tonality that Benson loved, and that was based on the paper that he chose to print it on, as well as the inks that he used. Now, this kind of print was simply impossible to make in 1980. There was no digital printing of photographs. And it's common in the photo world for artists to lament the quality lost when the shift was made from analog to digital, from darkroom printing to digital. Benson took the opposite stance. He embraced this change. He thought it was much better. He hated working in a darkroom, so that the personal always enters into it. I'll say more about his training in a moment, but he always wanted to have an additive relationship to any object he was making. He wanted to be able to build it the way a painter adds layers of pigment to a canvas or a panel, the way a chair maker builds chair piece by piece. So Benson, in addition to loving what was possible with the new technology, he liked the fact that he could sit in his office and fidget on a computer and then fidget with the printer to make it. Now, he didn't just hit print though when he made these. He would, when he made his digital prints, he would run them through the printer anywhere from 3 to 7 times on the same sheet of paper in order to get the quality of image that he wanted. And I'll say more about that as I go through more images. And the same thing, here we go. Benson uniquely came to photography through printing books. He was from a family of noted craftsmen and artisans. He was born and raised in Newport, Rhode Island. His father was John Howard Benson, who was a celebrated calligrapher and stone carver. John Howard, early in his life, had purchased the John Stevens shop in Newport, which is a stone carving shop. It has been in existence since 1706. No relation to the Bensons, but John Howard rather bought it from the Stevens family, and he revived and extended that tradition of stone carving that was there in Newport, most often with headstones for cemeteries and burial grounds, but also with lettering on many monumental buildings and many civic structures. Today, the company is overseen by a nephew of Richard Benson. It was long maintained by Benson's brother, John. So the generations of the Benson family have had this workshop. And this is the atmosphere that Benson was raised in a neighborhood where his father's workshop was just around the corner. There were a group of expert people working on the craft of in actually stone carving. And he was raised in a big old rambling 18th century house filled with handmade antiques. So this culture of making things and living with them is something that he grew up with. Now, he went to work as a young man at a company in Connecticut called the Meriden Gravure Company through his family connections. And Meriden Gravure at the time, he liked to point out that they never made gravures, but they were noted for printing very, very high quality art books, among other titles, with fine reproductions. And he was assigned to be the staff photographer. He would photograph the work of art that was going to be illustrated in the book. So a very technical, unintellectual task for most people. And this was the first time that he was making photographs. He was fascinated by the materiality of printing, by the efforts to get the finest reproductions one could. And he sort of fell in love simultaneously with the technology of printing and with the art of photography and the history of photography. And he learned them together, as it were. This is the first big project of his own work that he produced from 1973. It's called Laevis Laurel. One thing that happened to Benson at Meriden Gravure is that, as some of you know, when very serious people are publishing books, they're often on the printing press floor. They want to look at the proofs as they come out to see the quality. And so Benson made a lot of connections at Meriden Gravure. He met Doris Bree, who was the curator for Georgia O'Keeffe. He met Lee Friedlander, the photographer, who became a lifelong friend. He met, I think most importantly, Leslie Katz, the great publisher in New York who had founded the Akins Press, which still exists today as the Akins Press Foundation. Katz was deeply committed to making high quality books. And he and Benson had sort of a mind meld, and Benson, for the next 25 or 30 years, a lot of his work consisted of projects that Leslie Katz commissioned for the Akins Press. And this was the first one. It was a book about the St. Gaudens sculpture on the Boston Common, the Robert Gould Shaw Memorial. And Leslie Katz wanted a book about this monument specifically because the many soldiers who had died under General Shaw, who's the hero of the monument, were not named on the monument. Their names had not been carved on the monument. They were all Black soldiers. If you've seen the film Glory, that's a Hollywood version of the story of these people. And Leslie Katz wanted to honor the soldiers, the anonymous soldiers who had died. So Lincoln Kirsten and Richard Benson together made this book. I could go on about it. I'll just say that for me as a curator, I really understood Benson when I was preparing this material for the exhibition, because he made fine exhibition prints that were platinum prints to show it in galleries. He made silver work prints as maquettes for this book. And then he made the actual plates for the book himself, of course, because he knew how to do it at Meriden Gravure. And to his thinking, all of those different kinds of prints were absolutely of equal value and importance. He treasured them all. And so we had all of them in the exhibition. And that's really a key to sort of understanding his relationship to books and printing. The next major project that Benson worked on at the Akins Press was not his own. It was a book by his friend Lee Friedlander. And I should say Benson worked on dozens and dozens of books by other artists. He also made prints for other artists, many of them very famous, some of them famous for different reasons. If you've ever seen Madonna's Sex book, he did the separations for that. He earned a good living for many years to supplement his teaching, making books. But Friedlander, Lee Friedlander, who's a very celebrated American photographer, has called books his own media. Friedlander has devoted more attention to his own books than many other photographers have done. And he met Benson when he was printing his very first book, Self-Portrait, and Benson then worked on every book that Friedlander produced for the next nearly 30 years until the 1990s. And this is one they produced together for the Akins Press. I'm showing you the cover because this was a real collaborative effort, and I think it demonstrates the spirit of the people at the Akins Press and sort of the community that Leslie Katz had cultivated there. It's Friedlander's book. Every image in it is by him. It shows many sculptures, mostly in small town America, often in very quotidian circumstances. But Benson made the plates for the book, and he convinced Friedlander not to coat the pages. To the uninitiated, including me, it's hard to understand the differences, but Benson and Friedlander could talk for hours about the nuances of every type of paper, every coating that you may or may not apply. And Leslie Katz suggested the binding for the book. It's an unusual pin binding. You see the 3 black dots on the spine. And he wanted it that way so that small town libraries or schools could actually take the book apart and frame the prints and show them as photographs. He also wanted it to look like an old-fashioned accounting book or ledger book, sort of speaking to the kind of everyday American life that the photographs are about. It is considered by many, including me, to be a real masterpiece of the photo book, of photo books, and again, Benson was involved in it. But the thing for me is the sense of community, the kind of creative collaboration that Leslie Katz fostered. That also speaks to Benson's history. His father had fostered a workshop like that at the John Stevens shop. So his outlook about art making was not individual. It was really about a kind of collective effort. I'm going to show you a handful of Benson's own photographs that he made in the 1970s. And I already said that he sort of came to the art of photography a lot, with the technical side of it. He was avid about teaching himself how to make good photographs. He actually sought out Paul Caponegro, with whom he had connections, and went and talked to him and really practiced a great deal with his own camera. He did not, other than the St. Gaudens book that I showed you, he did not show many of these photographs in the 1970s. And they have, some of them have an intimate quality, like these two. The one on the left shows his wife, Barbara Benson. On the right is their living room in Hartford, Connecticut at the time. But I think there's a real quality to these pictures of what I call learning the standards. Benson, as I said, was an autodidact. And he was sort of going through the subjects and the approaches with a view camera that one could take. These prints are extraordinary and in their subtlety and very beautiful to see. Again, these are contact prints, 8 by 10 inches. So he's very traditional at this point with photography. And many people to this day, I think, perceive him as a real traditionalist, which is a mistake, because he went way beyond the traditions that he learned so well, so deeply. These are two other photographs, slightly later, but from the same decade. And I think they really show the range of Benson's thinking. He was fascinated by the past, had an antiquarian knowledge of many subjects. The image on the left depicts the John Stevens shop, his family's stone carving shop. Its title is Bill Gilliam's Toolbox. And I love this because that indeed was, that box in the picture belonged to a man named Bill Gilliam. Bill Gilliam died before Richard Benson was even born. He had been a carpenter and a wood carver in Newport, and he had rented space in the John Stevens shop when Benson's father took it over, and was long since dead in 1979. When this picture was made. But his tool chest was still there, and Benson kind of reverently photographed it, really trying to depict the past in a way that not many photographers of his generation were doing. There's a great history of this sort of outlook in the medium, but he was unusual in the 1970s for paying such close care with it. And on the right, from really almost the same moment, a very dynamic picture of the Pompidou Center. In the first months that it had opened. And you see again Benson's fascination with how things are made. He was, I'm sure, delighted by the building of the Pompidou, and focused on this sort of connection joint of the structure. Now Benson, with Leslie Katz's help, was striving to get grants. He cobbled a living together as an artist and a printer throughout these decades of his life. And he received 2 Guggenheim grants in the late 70s and early 80s, which were ostensibly for his own work, but they were really because the real purpose of them was that he wanted to investigate printing methods for books. And he wanted to achieve the finest photographic reproductions that he could. And he was curious about many different processes for doing this. Photogravure was one of them, but he had learned offset lithography at the Meriden Gravure Company. And offset, it is a workaday process. Nobody is reverent about offset lithography, possibly with the exception of Richard Benson. If you have really, really nice art museum posters from the 1980s, usually those are made in offset lithography. So that's the realm that we're talking about. But Benson had studied the process deeply because he had to for his first job. And he thought that it was just it had extraordinary potential. And he was very good at meeting funders and donors and enthusiasts who cared about what he did. And through Aiken's Press, he met Howard Gilman and Pierre Apraxin of the Gilman Paper Company collection. This was a private collection in New York in the 1980s. It is, I think, probably the finest private collection of photography that was ever assembled. Mostly 19th century work, but up through the mid 20th century. And the bulk of it is today at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. But this book was produced before it had found a museum home. And it is the very large book that's in the center of the room here on the table. Now, Benson was certain that if he could have the time and the resources to make very careful offset prints using a variety of inks and dyes, that he could achieve great reproductions. And the real test of that would be with early photographs, which are often extremely fragile and were made before there was a photo industry. So there are all kinds of homemade chemicals and surprises to those early prints. And they're all different colors. Benson missed that in 20th century photography. He wanted to bring it back in. That harkens back to what I was saying about the inkjet print he made with the blue tonality. And the Gilman collection had every type of early process you could think of, and really just exquisite, beautiful prints. So long story short, Benson was approached because they wanted to make reproductions of the photographs to hang on the walls of the company so that they could protect the fragile originals. And he, over many conversations, convinced them that they should allow him to make this book, which would have exact reproductions that are the same scale as every print. He worked for 7 years on this with Thomas Palmer, another great printer who really apprenticed with him for this project. And for every sheet in every copy of the book, they would run the sheet through a press anywhere from 3 to 7 times to get the different tonalities of these pictures. And the two images I'm showing you on the left, the young boy that's a salted paper print, so an early paper process for making photographs from the 1850s. Nobody knows who made it. It showed up in a Boston auction in the 1980s, so we think it came from Boston. And on the right is a great Philadelphia treasure. I wish it were still here, but it's at the Met, and it's a daguerreotype, so it's not made on paper at all. It's on metal. And that's a portrait of Frederick Langenheim, the Philadelphia photographer, made either as a self-portrait or by his brother. And so they're very different pictures. And you see the sort of tonality that he got from them with the sort of gold toning crackling into the daguerreotype, for instance. This book is considered a great masterpiece of photographic printing. You know, it's a book of reproductions. And I think that really sums up Benson's sensibility to a great degree, because he had so much reverence and love and interest and curiosity in what people had done previously, that he was willing to kind of take the time and you know, make them again. As I said, he wanted to make everything from scratch. So it's sort of like he was making these photographs again through the offset process. The last thing I'll say about this is that in 1985, this project won Benson a MacArthur Genius Award. I think it was the second year of the MacArthur Awards, and he was the recipient of one of the grants, which also surprises me that this great reproductive effort resulted in that, but it really helped his career a lot. He was very much in demand already to make separations for books, as I've indicated. But the grant from MacArthur really enabled him to take his own work in a new direction. And he experimented quite broadly, but he had decided that he was not going to go back in the darkroom ever again. Now that didn't quite happen. He did go back in the darkroom a little bit, but by and large, by the mid 80s, he was not in the darkroom anymore. And you know, the digital photography was on the horizon, but barely visible. So he was working with the offset process, and he started making this incredible series of prints, which are quite a bit larger than the photographs he had been able to print from the darkroom. Often using his old negatives, right? So this photograph, for instance, which is under one of the bridges in Memphis, Tennessee, he would have made this with his view camera, probably 8 or 10 years earlier. So it would have been an 8x10 negative. But through using the offset process, just as he had devised it for the Gilman book, he was able to make these larger prints. And again, these are basically posters, in terms of, the process that they were made by. And he always had to struggle with that. I mean, people, were not interested in collecting these because they didn't seem like real photographs, but they are astounding prints. And so he was making this work for a number of years, probably about 5 or 6 years. He made prints like these. So you see that lettering, whether it's carving in stone or writing graffiti, lettering comes up again and again in Benson's work. And that speaks to his formation with his father's workshop. And in fact, the headstones in the photograph on the left are in a cemetery in Newport, and they're 18th century stones carved by the John Stevens shop, the shop that his family took over. And you see here also his interest in the technology of printing, or he kind of fudged stone carving into the history of print as kind of an early version of it. And he was starting to think about the long history of technology writ large, but also of specific technologies. And he was commissioned in the 1990s to photograph the New York waterfront. It was not a successful commission, but and he was making chromogenic photography, which is old-fashioned color photography that you have to print in the darkroom. It's terrible. The colors never last. But he did make some amazing pictures, and I love this one where he has just focused in on this mess of graffiti with a chain link fence sort of dividing 2 different surfaces that have been covered in paint. And there's even a Japanese or Chinese kanji character sort of in the center of the image. And I think Benson would have delighted in that. Probably not any more able than we are to sort of decipher what any of these words are saying. But he had never put color photography into his work. He understood very well that color photography's origins were very different from the great 19th century things that I was just showing you. Really, color photography came out of advertising, and the whole logic of color photography, starting in the 1930s, was about addressing the consumer. And Benson liked that, but I think he wasn't sure what to do with it. And also, color photography just wasn't dependable. Color prints didn't last, and he wanted nothing to do with them. He wanted pictures that would last. So he's playing around with color. And as I've already said, the digital revolution was on the horizon. And by the early 1990s, Benson was an early adapter of digital photography. He understood not only that color photography had its origins in advertising, but also that digital photography, whatever pictures were made with it, its logic really revolved around color. The way that the printers were made, the way that the applications and systems were designed, it was to deal with all the many colors in the world. So he was thrilled by that, and he just dove in head first. This also corresponded roughly with the tail end of his career as a teacher and dean at Yale. And when he retired in 2006, he suddenly had the time to tinker a lot and also to travel and make pictures. So he entered the most prolific part of his artistic career and made hundreds of photographs like the 2 that you see here. Now, how did he make these? Well, he was still stuck on the processes that came out of offset, and he found a way. He bought commercial printers, like we'd all have in our office, and he found a way to rejigger them and to add ink heads and to work with computer programs so that he could put register marks on his sheets of paper that he was printing. And just as he did with offset, he would run them each sheet of paper through the printer multiple times, ultimately settling on three passes is the best way to make a print. And without seeing the prints in person, I think it's a little hard to convey, but if you look at the stop signs in the image on the left, and you see that they're 2 very different reds, right? Because the one has faded so much, the one on the bottom. That type of distinction between the 2 reds would have been almost impossible to get in earlier color photography. And this kind of control is what excited Benson. And he only could get it because of his artisanal approach, right? I mean, he's taking this industrial technology and he's really making it artisanal for himself. And this is what he did throughout his career. He was always, bringing technology back into the workshop to make things much better than any mass production of them could ever be. He was excited to talk about these prints. These are from the mid 2000s, and explained that he would print it, running the prints through the printer 3 times. He found a way to print blacks separately, blacks and grays separately. So that was one pass of the printing. And in his words, keeping them separate from the other colors allowed everything to open up because there's no thin layer of gray or black throughout the image. And so the images really, really pop. You see it in these apples too, which are amazing. And there's a book here of these pictures, which I'll talk about in a moment, so you'll be able to see more of them. Now, this is the period when he's not teaching anymore and he's not being a dean, when Benson not only could make many more photographs, but he also thought much more deeply about his ideas relating to photography and to printed pictures. And the real magnum opus to demonstrate that, he produced several books in this decade, but I think the greatest is this one, The Printed Picture, which the photography department at MoMA invited him to mount as an exhibition. This consisted entirely of his teaching materials from Yale, so he had always taught with objects. He had ancient little pieces of cuneiform all the way up to tear sheets from magazines that he would teach with. And those are the objects that were used in this exhibition. And the book is remarkable. It's very hard to get nowadays. There's one you can look at here because he devotes either 1 spread or 2 spreads to every technology, beginning with cave painting up to whatever the latest thing was in 2008. And I will say for the print and drawing scholars in the room, it does emphasize photography maybe a little more than print scholars would, but it is also just a tremendous dive into the long technology, long history of this technology of printed pictures. Benson was also working on a treatise about technology at this time, a tiny little book that he printed at home with no illustrations, no footnotes, there's no cover image, it's just this little paper thing called Me and Moki. Please note the poor grammar, Me and Moki. Moki was his dog. And this book is a treatise, a quite amazing radical treatise on the entire history of technology, beginning with language. He identifies language as maybe the first human technology. This is not the forum to go into his ideas. I will say there's not a single footnote in the book. He was not an academic. So it's a very unusual dive into theoretical writing for most people. But Benson was convinced that human technology, first of all, humans were not the creators of technology so much as we are the happy subjects. So Moki, his dog, is the model of what humans are going to become. Moki benefits from the world as it exists today because dogs adapted to humans, and he thinks humans will ultimately be like happy dogs who are fed and petted and don't have to worry about much. Now, I find that terrifying myself. He was optimistic about it. And he thought that human contributions to technology would, in the long history of the world, really just be a blip, maybe not even a discernible blip across the millennia. And this goes back to what I said about his valuing cumulative knowledge, right? Benson was more interested in how groups of people or generations of people adapt to new technology and adapt to knowledge than he was interested in sort of celebrating the great inventors or the great discoveries. This comes up, he never talked about it explicitly like that, but this comes up again and again and again in his work. And so he had this love and reverence for the whole history of a technology. This printing, of course, was the technology that he explored the most. There's another book on the table about maritime history. He was from Newport. He grew up around boats and sailing, and he had a great love for the history of boats as well. And so that was another technology that he explored that you can see in a book here. And then in 2011, MoMA published this book of these color photographs that I just described to you. It's a small book, and as you see from the spreads that I'm showing on the screen, the pictures nearly fill every page of the book. I think there are about 10 pages of writing in this book. It's mostly just pictures. And it is not, this is not a cool MoMA sensibility, this book. This is a raucous trip through 6 years of his photographs. This book from 2011 only showed pictures that he had started making in 2005. And I love this book for many reasons, but it sort of riffs on the tradition in photography of making a road trip book. Books like Robert Frank's The Americans, for instance. It's mostly his travels around North America with segues to Puerto Rico and the Bahamas. But as you spend time with the book, you realize that it's not about the United States at all, really. And it's not about a road trip. It's about geologic time. So you start, the first pages of the book are these images of raw stone and coastline, elemental imagery. And then actually I put these in the wrong order. I apologize. So then most of the book is devoted to what I call the long agricultural middle. So the bottom illustration there of the fencing and the rusty machine, that's sort of the middle of the book. Human technology kind of slowly advancing through the agricultural millennia. And then finally we land bumptiously in the contemporary moment with tacky, loud, garish American pop culture everywhere. And you see that maybe a little more subtly than I'm describing it in the mailboxes and those little houses in Baltimore that are all these different colors. So it appears to be a modest book and a book just of one artist's pictures from 6 years, but it's actually, I think, a remarkably ambitious and thoughtful and fun tour of his thinking about this long history of technology that he was working out. I should say that Miyamoki, his treatise, was only privately published. I actually have a copy of it here that I can pass around, but there are something like 17 of them. So the one I have is lent by his family. And so he never published that. He turned it into a taxonomy, a spreadsheet, an Excel spreadsheet called Tool Tax, which was unfinished at his death. But which is preserved at Yale University and is this vast compendium where he really did think about every technology and its sort of trajectory through time. Quite amazing. And I will end with this picture, this slide of two pictures. When I met Benson in 2013, I was working on Paul Strand, another artist that he had printed for. And I went to talk to him about Paul Strand. And artists usually, they are not interested in having you come talk to them about other artists. But he was generous. And by the end of the visit, I was as fascinated by him as I was by Strand. And one thing led to another. And that's why this project happened. But the work he was making then looked like this. He was a stamp collector, among other interests. And I have no interest in stamps at all. And I looked at these things and I didn't even know what to say. And then years later, he knew that we were going to work on this project and he sadly passed away. And then in 2018, I went to Newport and I was sitting at the kitchen table with his wife, Barbara. And I said, you know, Barbara, I just don't understand the stamps. And she looked at me and she said, good luck, because neither do I. But I actually have grown to be quite affectionate about these pictures. You'll see the title on the left is called Fancy Cancels. What he loved about these stamps, he collected ones that didn't have cancel marks, but what he loved about these is that these are all 19th century US stamps. And, you know, postal clerks in every town and every zip code, of course they didn't have them then, had to give their own cancel mark to a piece of mail to prove that the stamp had been paid for. And so people would usually with cork would just devise their own cancel marks and they might pick a certain color. And even before that, before we talk about the cancel marks, Benson loved stamps and currency, money, because he thought of them as very exquisite prints that were produced in unfathomable mass quantities, right? So again, he's not interested in the museum object. He's interested in the way that the printed image can kind of float through the world. So he loved stamps and money because of this quality of being these fine things that are made in billions and billions of versions. And then I think he loved these cancel marks because it's the individual putting their own stamp, their own mark onto it. And so you get this very human touch and this human history sort of overlaid on these mass-produced objects. I think he also probably liked the one on the right because it looks like Andrew Jackson is in jail. We know who likes Andrew Jackson. So so I will end my talk there. This is just sort of a brief window into the mind of Richard Benson, but he really should be much more famous than he is. So thank you for hearing me out. And I'm happy to take questions or
Yeah,
look at books.
thank you so much. I mean, there are such riches here thinking about print technologies, prints, reproductions, books. So many topics to discuss, and Liliana has a question. Pardon?
Stop your screen share there.
Oh, sure.
So we can also see our speakers.
How do I
our-
do that?
our-
Oh, I see.
our
Stop share.
Visitors.
I am not a tech. It's amazing that I worked on Richard Benson because I am the most untechnological person you can think of. Anyway.
Liliana.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry, my voice is still catching up with me. I would like to ask a little bit more about the concept of technology. Starting out with the last images on the strands of the constellation. Let me take this to look back to an early 20th century theory of technology and photographic reproduction of academia, where he claims that technology does away with the aura of the original, that we can now mass produce and so on. And it seems to me that Benson is turning it on around, that he is using his technological savvy also to produce unique items like the canvas and go back to another idea of the original. It may be a print which is layered through times. It may be a special tonality that he puts together, but it's quite the opposite of what he claims in the book, meaning looking at technology in service of the human print.
Well, thank you for that question and observation. I do not disagree with you. I think he is, from one perspective, he is turning Benjamin's ideas upside down, just to some extent. One aspect of Benson's thought that I wanted to talk about today, and I decided there wasn't going to be time, is the fact that he was the opposite of a connoisseur or a bibliophile. He had rare books and prints all over his office, all over his workshop. He would give them to people. His own copies of things were usually tattered messes. And he had no interest in that kind of rarefied object status of things in the museum. He wasn't interested in the aura of things. And that's a paradox. It's a contradiction. I cannot explain it given how much time and thought he devoted to making objects, which are so beautiful and fine, but it simply didn't interest him. I'll tell you an anecdote. He had printed for Paul Strand. I mentioned that. We have the Strand archive at the Art Museum. We own many really beautiful prints that he made from Strand's negatives. And when I visited him, he had boxes of unfinished prints, which were really fascinating, where he was experimenting with different approaches to each of Strand's negatives. And they weren't mounted, they were curled. They're just, it's like a shoebox of prints. And he said, the museum should have these. They should be with the archive. And I agreed. And he said, but wait a minute, you can't make them museum objects. You cannot accession these. You have got to let students touch these with their bare hands, no gloves. And so I agreed. And then, of course, I had registrars at the museum and conservators who did not agree. So to date, we have not let anybody touch them with their hands. But all of this is just to say that you are correct. But I also think that in spirit, Benson just was not interested in the aura of rare objects.
Go ahead.
Okay, and I just want to question the concept of the aura is something I'm not sure for the music.
Mhm.
I think if one thinks of it as a unique achievement or something that is striving for as a kind of exclusive print for him, is something that gives you the unique experience that I think we all have when looking.
Mhm.
That's it. Whether it goes into the museum or gets a price tag or is not to be touched is a very different issue.
Agreed. However, I mean, but of course, Benjamin was, you know, thinking about this from a Marxist perspective, right? So I was thinking about that with almost literal sense of aura.
Yeah, I mean, thinking about the paradox of him, he's not interested in the rare object, he's interested in making photographs more accessible as they are printed in books, and yet these are fine printed books.
He wanted
Right.
them to be accessible and also as marvelous as possible,
Yeah.
right? And I mean, other artists have faced this contradiction or this paradox.
And these are presumably expensive books, and
For the
the
most
most
part,
part,
but
yeah.
they don't always start out that way.
Yeah.
I mean, the printed picture, the MoMA book now, it's hundreds of dollars, but
Yeah.
you know, originally it was not.
Yeah.
It was not
and I
priced.
mean, it reaches its like extraordinary culmination in the photographs from the collection of the Gilman Paper Company. Question, like dumb question about the technology. Is each copy of that book identical, and are the prints, which are tipped in, they're not printed in the book, they're produced separately, they're tipped in.
Mhm.
Are the prints in each copy of the book identical, or are they artisanal productions and different in each? Have you had an opportunity to compare copies?
I have. We had
Yeah.
2 copies in our exhibition, and my answer is not going to satisfy you. It's both.
Yeah.
So he and Thomas Palmer, who's a celebrated printer still working today in Rhode Island, made this book with Benson. And they strove to make every print of a given image the same. And they would often run 3 or 4 images through a press together because they could do their magic and use different inks for each phase. But every single tipped in sheet of paper is run through a press, as I said, up to 7 times. So there are variations. I think they're slight. To get back to the question about aura, I mean, in a sense, he was trying to save the aura of these other works, right? Which had nothing to do with himself. It was about these fragile photographs that it wasn't safe to look at anymore. So there is a consistency to them, as much as 2 guys in a workshop, you know, making dozens and dozens of passes through what press could achieve.
And one other question, did he do the original photography of the object? So that, let's say there's a daguerreotype. Who did the photograph of the daguerreotype?
That's a good question. There should be credit in there. I'm going to guess he didn't do all of it.
Mhm.
There's a funny story. If you know another MoMA publication, The Work of Atget, which is this 4-volume publication about Eugène Atget, the French photographer, he made all of the separations for that while he was working on this book. And they would send the negatives, Atget's glass negatives, to Newport so that Benson could make his photographs from those. So he often had very rare things that he was, you know, working with in the studio. I think probably the Gilman Company did have him photograph most of he and Thomas Palmer when they could. Another project he worked on earlier was called The Face of Lincoln, and it was an effort to reproduce every known photograph of Abraham Lincoln, which sounds kind of awful, and it's just amazing. The book was too big to bring today. But in that case, he was traveling around to the Library of Congress in many places and setting up shop and making photographs himself.
Yes, I mean, he has this very strange position of being the faithful reproducer of earlier images, but also the creator of those images so that they can be reproduced.
Yeah, exactly.
We do some chat in line.
Yeah, we have quite a few from the chat. First 2 are short, so I can read both of them. Michael Winship asks, where will I have to go to read Me and Loki? I should add that Richard Benson is hardly an obscure name in this household. And then Harold asks, what were Benson's contributions to his collaboration with Paul Strand in the early 1970s printing of the White Fence?
Okay, so I'll answer the first one first. So Me and Moki is impossible to read right now unless you have a copy of the book. And as I said, there are only about 7 of them. There's a group of us who want to publish this very strange theoretical treatise. So please stay tuned. Because it was really a homemade production. The question about Paul Strand and his well-known photograph of the White Fence, which is one of his modernist efforts from the 1910s. When Richard Benson met Paul Strand, Strand was in his 80s and was very sick and had never allowed anybody to print from his negatives, but could no longer do it himself. So Benson actually went and spent 3 summers in France with Strand, learning how to make prints as Strand wanted them to be made, and also looking at all of Strand's prints together. But by the time he was making those prints, Strand died in the course of that process. And so Benson had some degree of autonomy. And one thing I've done at the museum in the past, we happen to own one of the very rare big prints that Strand made of his photograph, Wall Street. And a platinum print from, when he made the picture. And then we have a black and white, a silver print that he made in the 60s, which is much different. And then we have a platinum print made by Richard Benson. And if you look at them together, especially the 2 platinum prints, you see where Benson veered away from Strand in certain things. In that case, he would open the picture up more and sort of give you more highlights. Impossible to talk about when you're not looking at the pictures, but just to say that, really it's when an artist is making a print like that, there's of course subjective choice going on, and Strand and Benson both understood that, and you can see minor differences, but Benson's prints are very true to Strand's sensibility.
Do you think Benson embraced digital photography in part because there was no physical original, as in like a physical negative?
Well, I think he liked that about it, to be sure. But, Strand was excited by all the directions that technology could take. And, there are a lot of dead ends in any technology. He didn't always spend so much time on those, but he was interested in those as well. If you look at the printed picture, there are many, small chapters about things that didn't last long. I mean, the image I showed you, I didn't talk about, but that was seed packets from the early 1900s with a very particular process that didn't have a very long life. So I think he certainly loved the idea that the materiality of I don't know if he loved the idea, but he was excited by the loss of materiality that was promised by digital technology. And that's why he was, by the end of his life, he was championing the quality of screens and saying, now screens are at a level where, they can give you color quality and image quality that no printer of any sort could ever achieve.
Andre.
Peter, thank you so much. This was fascinating. While I agree with the gist of your argument around Benson as a technological innovator and how to hunt for the rare qualitative image and so on, which I all agree with, I would love to hear you put the particular nostalgia of this project, which I think is still there, into words. Because I do see it maybe not so much on the technological level, but on a thematic one, certainly, right? Because we are, this feels a little bit like fusion, reimagining the Middle Ages to me. You're always in the gone, the former plantation in Puerto Rico, and then all the kind of reproductions of bygone imagery, that version of America, I don't know, this German likes to call it America, and it's sort of small town ethos and those mailbox, I just like you give some words to the overall kind of image world nostalgia that is created because of or despite, I guess, is what I'm asking you,
Yeah,
the kind of
yeah.
technological innovation that he's seeking.
Mhm. That's a really good question. And I have to reprimand myself a little bit because I think part of what you're seeing there has to do with my own choices of the images that I wanted to show today. There is certainly, I would not call it nostalgia in Benson. He was really a deeply unnostalgic person. He believed, however, deeply in democracy. He wanted American democracy to work. And he didn't think it worked perfectly well at all. And he was especially committed to race issues from the 1970s on. His two oldest children were multiracial. And so he and his wife, the reason they would go to Puerto Rico is that they had these two children and experienced racism immediately and very, very materially in their own neighborhoods. And so they immediately started living in multiracial neighborhoods and only really traveling to places in the world where they would feel comfortable as a family. So that sort of biographical background informed a lot of his thinking and his approach to making work. And if people flip through the books that are here, I think they would start to see that. So to talk just at a technological level, Benson always wanted to understand how things were made, right? Whether it was a steam engine or a print or a photograph or a painting, he always wanted to understand how it was done. And that was his way of knowing things, and his way of understanding them was to think about it through that sort of craft approach. What I find remarkable about him, because I too, most people, who first encounter his work think, oh, okay, he was a craft person. He was, reverential for these old traditions. And he wanted to understand them, but he was very excited to shed them, to move forward, for not just for technology to change, but for people to change as well, through this kind of very fast-paced world that we're in of change. I don't think that answers the full question because there's a lot of traditional imagery in the pictures, and he was not interested in. I'm trying to think. There's a great quote from him where he said that he was so fascinated by the pictures that the world could offer up. He wasn't interested in trying to be innovative about his subjects and his pictures. That the title of our exhibition, "The World is Smarter Than You Are," that was an exhortation he made to his students again and again, basically saying, like, get out of your own head, stop this idea of trying to make a series that's rooted in some abstract idea you have about the world. The world is challenging to deal with. Making anything is hard because you as a maker, whatever you're making, you have an idea of what you're going to make, and then you try to do it, and there are all of these barriers to it, both physical and mental. So, he always wanted artists and students to stop thinking about their ideas and just go out and grapple with the world, right? So he did that, and he did that in a very conventional way, and this is something I think actually that he had in common with Paul Strand, who also sort of left behind modernist ambitions in terms of aesthetics and wanted to grapple with the world and all of its complexity, which again, in the case of Strand, often looks very traditional, and people sort of puzzle over it. And I would say that the pictures are often traditional, but the ideas are not in the case of Benson. And to me, that's one thing that's really fascinating about him.
I wonder if you could talk more about his larger view of technology itself, because one strand of what you're saying seems like he did think technology was kind of could improve things in the sense that screens have gotten better. The book, the printed picture, in the history of printing imagery and particularly color imagery, might imply that and you said it gives more attention to photography, like we've gotten better at this. The bizarre book about his dog almost sounds again like there's a kind of evolutionary.
Yes, no, there's no footnote, but Charles Darwin is all through. The Origin of Species is like the reference point for that.
then say by contrast, he's interested, as you say in that book, in little dead ends, things that did not. So one strand of his work seems to imply a kind of progressivism, a technological. This maybe another version of the same
Yeah,
question.
no, it's. I'm
And
seeing that.
another is kind of quirky. It's not necessarily nostalgic, actually, because it's interested in like failed technology, old things that don't really work that well, to print in color, some of those techniques. You could see the faulty registration, things like that on the image you reproduced on the screen. So I wonder, do you have a sense of his relationship to technology per se? He's clearly a crafts person, but did he have a sense of like, well, we're now getting better, but now I can use color because we're getting better at it.
Oh,
Well,
absolutely.
now,
Yes, that's in there. And to speak both to your question and Andre's, Benson was an optimist, right? He was an avowed optimist. He understood that about himself. It was his temperament. So there's a kind of a happy-go-lucky quality, which is not. I don't want to imply it's not serious, but it is happy-go-lucky. He is optimistic about technology, sort of not carrying us through, but it's going to happen, right? The world is going to keep changing, and he had theories that everybody can sort of absorb change, technological change, from their birth up until maybe about age 30, and then it becomes a real problem for all of us. And one of the themes of the exhibition that I didn't have time to get into today is that he writes a lot in the Moki about living rooms at the end of the book, and he talks about all the antiques and heirlooms in his living room, describes them and says, the world is changing so rapidly that we all need spaces to hold on to our past and to sort of hold on to our lives and ourselves as people, because human beings just can't change as quickly as technology does. And so he sort of identifies living rooms as the places where we can do this. Now, I see living rooms everywhere in his work, including, 3 thrown out bar chairs behind a building in Selma, Alabama, with a Coke tray as an improvised table, right? So for him, anywhere that you could kind of have a human community for engagement, I think becomes a living room. And that was very much, he thought about that in terms of how individuals navigate this incessant change that we're dealing with. I find his optimism, especially in the book Ian Moki that nobody's seen, I find it terrifying, actually, because he, first of all, environmental change, climate change, he seems not to worry about at all. It's just, he just thinks that, the world is going to keep changing, and, there were cataclysmic disasters in the past that were far worse than what we're doing. And so it's somewhat chilling, in fact. And, in his personal life, he was a very conscientious civic person, right? So there's a disconnect between the life of Richard Benson and sort of the way that he's talking about change in that book. But he was unapologetic about it. And as I said, he really thought that humanity we were basically going to be like dogs. And he loves dogs, but it was like, we just don't matter that much. He was absolutely an atheist. He didn't, this was not about a higher power for him. And he didn't, as far as I know, he didn't probe far beyond that in trying to explain it.
I did note in the photograph you showed of his own living room, there was the living room and the open door to the bathroom.
With the toilet.
Once for the
right?
toilet,
Yeah.
right? So
Sort of
all the
spotlight on
mod
those
cons,
financial, so.
yeah.
There might be
No.
more stuff there.
Yeah, can you talk about Benson's legacy? How is his estate handling his work? Is there a representative working on printing his work?
So there are, Benson never made a lot of prints because there was never much of a market for them. We have a wonderful collection at the museum. And right now his family is not selling any prints. And so it's unclear what's going to happen. I doubt that anybody will ever make more prints, simply because nobody could. Artists would travel to Newport hoping to learn the offset process from him, or the digital process. And it's so artisanal, it's so specific, and it's so laborious. He would take hours and hours and hours for one sheet that nobody could do it. And so I think it's unrealistic to think that anybody will continue. And this is another paradox about Benson, right? He was very enthusiastic about technology, but no matter what technology you threw at him, he harnessed it to this artisanal workshop way of doing things. And it's a paradox, you know.
To what extent are his prints tied to the specific printer he used or the specific computer he used?
I don't think that's as important because he, you know, I mean, yes, he jiggered these machines and did things to them to make them work. He left plenty of instructions about how to do that. And, you know, he would, you know, he used one of the standard Epson printers. I mean, it was, you know, he wasn't, he was starting with what industry could provide, and then he was sort of crafting it from there. But, you know, he understood about himself that, you know, these were his obsessions. And so, you know, they were going to end with him in a certain sense. You know, there's not a whole lot of work left, and I don't know, you know, I don't know what will happen with what's out there in the world. But we have a collection of about 190 of his prints at the museum. The Museum of Modern Art also has a great collection, and Yale that he taught. So.
This is just incredibly fascinating. Thank you so much. And I feel like there's a zillion directions that we could continue the conversation in, but I didn't hear you, just to add in another sort of techno artisanal thing, and I didn't hear you talk too much about what his thoughts on paper were. And although you did mention this very interesting debate about coded or not coded, or I mean, that was, yeah, I mean, we all think about, I guess, with the handle in our book. So I'd be curious about that. And then maybe just another thing you could talk about if you wanted or not, sort of what you were coming to at the end. We feel like sort of the kind of the other end or the complement to the sort of things he's doing and the people he's working with in a way, or all the people in sort of modern America and other places who are doing fine press and, you know,
Yeah.
sort of the craft of the printed book. And, you know, we have a huge collection of these, and there's always, you know, these print presses all over the country.
Mhm.
Did he have a relationship with any of that? It's kind of a world of itself. And
Yeah.
it sounds like in some ways he wouldn't have wanted that. And yet you could also imagine those people approaching him to do work with them.
Mhm, mhm. Well, he did. I mean, the Aikens Press was.
I guess, I
was
mean, it
his
is one of
home.
those presses, yeah.
And David Godine, the publisher, was another great patron of Benson's and commissioned work from him. He had a certain amount of impatience with the nostalgia
Yeah, I mean, it's
of-
it is that,
of-
yeah.
places and people like that. I mean, he was not interested at all in making old processes just for their own sake, you know, or dressing up for tintypes, that kind of thing. Really did not interest him. He cared deeply about papers and
Okay.
inks, and I don't have the technical knowledge to talk about that in depth, nor do I think it would be very interesting if I started to recount his opinions on papers and inks. But I mean, he and Lee Friedlander would have extended conversations about these things. So he cared about it a lot, and like many photographers and other artists in the 20th century, he was always frustrated by the limitations of mass-produced supplies right now. And this is one reason he did love 19th century photography, is that everybody was their own cook in their own homes and darkrooms making these prints, and you just ended up with all of this variety. And I think more than the nostalgia for that period, he wanted that diversity of different looks of things, which you see in the Gilman book. He wanted that back for photography, and he wanted it in his own prints, and he got it, but of course he got it in this very, very specific way. I should say that both of those questions about his legacy, I should have mentioned his students in his teaching, because he was a great teacher. This exhibition is actually traveling to Florida in the winter, and we're going to include work by a number of the students who worked with him, from Daoud Bey to Anli Lee to any number of other artists, about 10 artists, not any number. And what always strikes me when I talk to people who studied with him is that their work, you could not find a group of artists who are more different from each other, whose subjects, the materials they use, everything is very different. And so, he was not a teacher whose students ended up making work that looks like his. It was very much about really pushing people to go out because the world is smarter than they were, and to kind of grapple with things as they found them. So I mean, to me, that is one of the marks of his greatness as a teacher, and that part of his legacy, I think, is really significant, and his students certainly would think so. If any of them are on this talk, they'll castigate me for not saying more about that.
But we have one of his students in the room. I'm Sharka, would you care to
Oh, yeah.
talk about
I pick up those photograph.
Okay.
I was interested in him teaching. He was already like in the 80s. So although I wasn't so much interested in photography, I really wanted to teach photography.
Okay.
Thanks so much, Peter. I have a question. One of the things that struck me, you're talking about the difference in technology and screens and how they could reproduce color and all of that. But then we're talking about making print. But then the question becomes, what is the primary access to his work, especially this later work that when we're developing the technology? I mean, it would seem that the screen rather than the printed page would be that.
Absolutely.
And so how does that work with his legacy or access or any of those kinds of issues around the world?
So he left that unresolved. He died sooner than he thought he would, and that any of us wanted him to. But his last great project was called The Contraption. That's what he called it. And it was basically his effort to put his work onto digital files, because he believed that the technology of looking at things on a screen had, as I said, had exceeded anything that printing could do. And we wrestled with putting The Contraption in the exhibition. We have his monitor. We could have shown it. Without him there talking about it, technology had already changed so much since 2017 when he died. It would have just felt like a monitor with some pictures on it. So there was no way to bring his thinking about it alive for the exhibition. One thing that interests me about it is that he was putting his work from across his career. So everything from the 60s up to the more recent stuff. He was arranging things in different chapters that you could, using the technology of the application, you could mix and match yourself to some extent, although he was controlling the presentation. But he also was trying to put other artists' work from the past. And he had only just gotten started, but he had put a bunch of Atget's work in The Contraption, and he had photographed all of Cartier-Bresson's book, the title of it, one of the key books. Now, to speak to Andre's question, that's a very traditional history of photography, but he had only just begun it. And I think his argument was going to be that we should not be afraid of this, leaving print behind, that the new technology would absorb the whole history of the medium. And again, he was sunny optimist.
No,
Yeah, but that counters what you do in the exhibit, because the exhibit can only be of things that are printed and not.
Yeah,
kind of
no, I'm aware of that. I mean, I really wanted to have virtual imagery in the show, but there was no way to do it in a way that would have been visually interesting. Now, Benson might have gotten there, and I'm sure others will, but in terms of what he had created virtually or digitally at that point, it just wasn't. It would have just been a dud in the exhibition. So we ended with the stamps instead.
No, it's just really curious.
Yeah, no, it is. I mean, and he was very happy that this collection was coming to the museum. He knew that these prints were going to be there, but he also had kind of an indifferent relationship to the art world and to, as I said, to fine objects and to museums. That it just wasn't where his head was. He was always more interested in the how are we going to do this question than in celebrating a beautiful thing.
I mean, a nuts and bolts question, which I ask a lot of nuts and bolts questions. He is controlling the image. If I'm looking at the image on the screen, of course, I can change the brightness on my screen and therefore change the image completely. Was he assuming that controls would be built in so that the individual viewer cannot alter the image.
Yeah, he
In the
was,
same
he
way,
was pretty controlling.
Yeah, yeah, so I mean, how would
Yes.
that?
So no, I mean, he would, when he was working with a monitor, the contraption, he was tinkering for hours and hours and hours and days to get exactly the color relationships that he wanted. And I don't know if he thought through how that would be controlled or not.
Yeah.
Moving forward.
Jessica Linker asks just simply, how did Benson define technology?
So that's a great question, because I read up on, when I was starting to grapple with this, I looked at a lot of books on the history of science, thinking, okay, this field, that's about technology. And he, and he was not an academic, so you can't, it's not an apples for apples kind of a comparison. But Benson very loosely defines technology much more broadly than I found it defined by historians of science. So as I said, he begins basically with language. And anything that somebody picks up and uses is a tool. And he was always interested in then how that tool over generations changes, right? So the hammer that starts out as a rock that you hit this with, and then following that all the way through time. That's what the taxonomy is, the tool tax is trying to do. So it's taken very broadly. And in his treatise, Miyamoki, he starts out talking about living, animate things, plants and animals, and inanimate things, rocks and metals. But he doesn't spend much time on that. And then it's really about technology, beginning with language, up to, digital code and everything.
Any other questions, comments in the room or online?
Quick question.
Yeah.
Can you explain the career at Yale? He is hardly the Yale type.
No,
Um,
he was aware of that.
and do you know, and how the art school would have responded to his?
Well, the art school changed a lot dramatically right after his deanship ended. So it's a very different place now. There's a long history of photography at Yale, starting with Walker Evans, and who was there in the 60s teaching. And Evans, along with Paul Strand, is one of the artists that Benson printed for. So they developed a rapport. And Todd Papageorge, another eminent photographer who was at Yale, was already teaching there. And Todd Papageorge really was interested in what Benson was doing. And I think recognized that he was so different from Papageorge, who's really, kind of a poet with photography. Papageorge wanted this very different sensibility coming in to the program. So it was about personalities, as often those decisions are. And Benson, he didn't change. He didn't try to intellectualize himself. He was interested in the questions he was interested in, which had everything to do with how are you going to make this? And you can't, you're not making it very well. So what are you going to do about that? And that's what he brought to the crit sessions, which were so famous at the Yale School of Art. And it seems to have worked, in part because he was a fish out of water, but he was not only an optimist, he was very good at getting along with people. So he made it work. But it is really amazing to me that he wasn't disdainful of academia. He respected it quite a lot, but he wasn't interested in most of the questions that academic thinking produces. And so there he was in the heart of it, for 40 years. Happily so.
Well, I think we'll now stop our discussion, and those of us who are in the room will be fortunate enough to be able to look at the books on the table, including the most extraordinary book on the table, and also continue our chat with Peter. And I really, join you all, I assume, in thanking him for what was really a terrific session.
Thank you.